Thank you for joining us here at the start of another day of action here at Hearthstone Grandmasters, kicking things off nice and early with another day full of Asia-Pacific Hearthstone play. Two players that we have coming up now, one of the best-known players in APAC against one of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the least well-known players here in Asia-Pacific, because a lot of the players, even if they're not so well-known to the English-speaking community, are very popular streamers within their own language, very successful tournament players as well, whereas Kin, despite having a lot of success and respect amongst the pro community as a kind of insular unit, to the wider audience, I think is still yet to make that big breakout performance where he becomes a household Hearthstone name. But if he keeps on plugging away here in GM, I think it's only a matter of time, Gia.
It's true. I think as somebody that is from APAC, of course, I know Kin best for
Mm.
being the gold medalist at the Asian Games 2 years ago, and he's just been solid every single time. The pleasure of casting his matches. I don't remember a time when I've seen Kin just play badly. It just seems that it's this year with this specific system that he's been given a chance to shine, and I really, really hope that he can prove that he has what it takes because his performance last season, I don't think reflected how much work he was putting into the game.
Oh, no, Gia, I was talking about Surrender being the up-and-comer. Kin's won a literal Olympic gold medal. I don't know what you're talking about. Who's this Surrender guy? Don't even know what he's done.
He
Obvious
drinks
joke
little
there.
sips of tea, Derek.
He
That's what he's
does.
best known for.
The tiniest sips you will ever see. Hopefully, we can get a strong rendition today. The other thing that he is most well known for, Gia, is being the only player, the only lunatic crazy enough to not bring Warrior in a meta where every other APAC player is bringing it. Every single EU GM is bringing it as well. And I think almost all of the Americas GMs as well. What on earth is his thought process here?
I mean, I would love to pick Surrender's brain about this because at first glance, it feels like having Warrior means you get a free ban. I mean, your opponent is almost always forced to ban this
Yeah.
because it just across the board. It is heavily threatening in a last hero standing format as a deck that can sweep an entire lineup. But Surrender might be thinking that if he is going to ban the opponent's warrior, then then he would expect his warrior, if he brought it, to get banned also. And so he would rather target more heavily against the remaining decks. That's my best guess.
It's as good a guess as any, because if there's anything we've seen in yesterday, and also I'm bringing a bit of my ladder experience in here and the practice experience we did, the aggro decks aren't looking quite so hot, at least here in APAC. Mage in particular for me is the real weird one. We saw yesterday Viper over in Europe, Grandmasters do very, very well with the Weapon Rogue, just consistently hitting his opponent in the face with those self-sharpening swords and doing very, very well with that. The players struggling to fight back against that onslaught. But I will say, if anyone can get these decks done, it's going to be Surrender. So good at these weird, finicky little combo aggro style decks.
Definitely. The mage in particular, I feel Surrender has had maybe some lines that we didn't agree with of his Sorcerer's Apprentice timing, but you could always see where his macro game plan was at. If he was playing for tempo, he would be consistent with it. He is, however, starting off with this Druid into Kin's Highlander Priest, and it seems like almost every Highlander Priest we've seen in APAC on stream has had Zephyrus very early. No Raise Dead quite yet, and for Surrender, though, he has a little bit of Ramp and Guardian Animals, so looks like both with decent draws here.
And Kin, if he wants it, also has some ramp with just Zephyrus on 2 into, you'd have to imagine, Wild Growth on 3. I don't see this hand particularly working well with an Animal Companion starting hand. So I really like his choice of going for Wild Growth there. And while I was just talking about Surrender being very good at those kind of Mage, Rogue, aggressive style decks that he showed such proficiency with like the Highlander Hunter last season as a similar example, this type of deck from Kin is exactly what his specialty is. Priest, control decks in general, which is why I think we're seeing him bring the Galakrond Warlock as another kind of slow-ish deck. This is what he does best.
Yes, he definitely has that mental stamina to play for very, very long matchups.
That's
and
true.
Priest mirrors tend to go quite long, even though maybe not as long in this meta than in the Bucharest meta previously. I also want to expound on the point you brought up of this not looking like an Animal Companion hand, and I absolutely agree. There are some ways that Priest can try and get under the Druid curve, or at least pressure them before guardian animals can come down. But that's usually supported by when you have more minions, when you have buff cards. But Kin's hand is so reactive. He has tons of removal spells and Galakron. So it's looking like he just wants to get the most mana to set up for when Surrender goes guardian animals and respond as efficiently as possible. And it looks very well like it is going to start this turn.
Yeah, I absolutely love just getting the damage rolling as quick as possible for Surrender. Not being too greedy and trying to activate a Kael'thas anytime soon. That'll come after the overflow, most likely. And now, like you said, it's just a case of trying to respond as well as Kin can, but it's the wave of 4 attack minions here. It's a nightmare to deal with.
Absolutely. Nothing that he can do that's super clean, because Wave of Apathy, while it does put everything in the range of Shadow Madness, then it doesn't kill anything because the minion you'll be stealing only has 1 attack. He could start off with a Renew and start digging instead. If he can generate an AoE here, plus the Holy Smite, that could get through a decent chunk of the board.
I mean, the question for me is just whether or not this is a Sethic turn, which is the big consideration, because he can fit in a lot of spells here, you know, especially with the Renew, discovering 2, or generating 2 spells potentially. And in the end, he ends up with a Grave Rune for a really aggressive push onto this board, and hopefully sticking at least 1 Sethic to pop off next turn. This is smart.
That's a pretty good result here. I have to imagine if he didn't generate that Grave Rune, we could have seen the Renew chain pop off. Kin, they're just prioritizing getting rid of the Lake Thresher because these 2 Teacher's Pets, of course, spawn 3-cost beasts after they die, and so Kin is not necessarily removing that much damage off the board if he deals with them. So he's kind of just saying, I want to narrow down the threats, maybe try to get a better Galakron for the next turn, and go from there. It's obviously not an ideal spot for him to be in, but I think he leaves himself the most flexibility for the next turn. For Surrender, this is a pretty nice overflow. Just has to think about whether he wants to take some trades, but because this Sethic multiplies after he hits it, he's probably just going to leave it alone.
Yeah, that was a deceptively difficult turn, in my opinion, there that Surrender had, because there's a benefit to going Lightning Bloom plus Ysera. You want to get that down as soon as possible so that you can go Overflow afterwards. But at the same time, against Priest, you don't really want to hit all your dragons at the same time with one big Overflow. You kind of want to get them a little bit at a time so their mass AoE doesn't really get the job done.
For Surrender, this Druid list is actually a bit more threat dense than what we were seeing in previous weeks. It has 2 copies of the 3 beasts you normally run and the double broomsticks. It's Guardian Animals now. Lake Thresher in hand, 2 Teacher's Pets. So it's just gonna draw out the 1 Twilight Runner after that overdraw.
Right, yes.
And so the Kael'thas nerf is definitely looking like coming into play at some point. You could just see the survival of the fittest come down with the Lightning Bloom this turn.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a Lake Thresher Broom turn here instead, just because it really nicely allows you to clean up everything that's threatening you here. Apart from the King Muckler that was generated. That you're not going to be able to clear up so easily.
Yeah, I suppose a taunt being generated is also a slightly inconvenient scenario, but the clear is still available because the Broom itself will rush. And so we're looking at Silverback into 2-1, and then Rusher into middle guy, and then the Broom for the win.
Alright, I'm sorry for doubting you, Broom. I take it back, alright? You can always sweep up the board. There are no doubts.
And now Kin is back in the responding spot. Of course, this is Highlander Priest, so less consistent ways to invoke Galakron here. Yeah, he doesn't have Holy Smite anymore to try and snipe something off and give himself the best chance of getting rid of the Lake Thresher. There's an option for this Shadow Madness on the Silverback, just to deal with 2 things. Or he could steal the Teacher's Pet and take the... Oh, wow. This is very nice. Yeah. He gets the Death Rattle and generates 2 more Teacher's Pets.
This is it, man. This is what I'm talking about with Kin. He spots these weird lines. He's played these decks ad infinitum at this point. It's ridiculous the amount of these long, grindy games that he can play and practice out. And he sees things like this that most players would miss.
Yeah, or at least he sees them much quicker than you and I would have. And in the spot for surrender, definitely I would have prioritized getting the survival of the fittest down sooner. The triple Sethic board was very threatening, so in the end I agree with what surrender went for, but I have to imagine that the survival is still on his mind just to try and get the most use out of this cleave. This looks very clean, right?
It does, yeah. I'm trying to see if there's any way you can, on average, cheese it out so that you can go overflow first, and that will be drawing you enough spells so that you can go survival of the fittest afterwards and get like a double activation. But then again, I'm not used to living in a 1-mana Kael'thas spell world instead of the 0.
Surrender just going for the wild growth there to get it out of hand. Of course, he was going to hit 10 mana naturally next turn, but he wants to create some space for the overflow that he'll be playing next turn. Also worth noting that these Elex are kind of clogging up Kin's deck because any spell played gets added into the pool of that and then shuffled into Kin's deck after it dies.
And this is what I love about Surrender. So many players I've seen misorder that, where they don't want to shuffle cards into their opponent's deck. But no, it's good. They don't want a Bog Beam. That's a bad card at this point.
They also don't want a survival of the fittest. That is extremely expensive here. But Kin has a good way of dealing with 2 of these threats. Surrender hates to see that target, but there's a Shadow Word Death anyway. So, the Kael'thas was always dying one way or another. I suppose it's just unfortunate that 2 out of 3 times Kin gets this outcome.
It was well ordered there by Kin.
Guardian Animal still just pulling out the one Twilight Runner, which has no target to rush into, so I can't imagine that that would be #1 priority for Surrender. But problem with the overflow is he would end up with 5 cards in deck, and then the Ysera following up means that the dragons are very likely to come down one after the other. And you mentioned why you don't necessarily want that against Priests when they can play Plague of Death or Soul Mirror, but it's coming to the point where the other option is just passing, so I would still advocate the overflow.
Yeah, I think the real deck that you don't want to do that against is Warrior, with Brawl and obviously the power of Bladestorm as well, if you have a bunch of high health minions. Against Priest, with only 1 Plague of Death, Zephrys already having been played, Soul Mirror not always lining up well against the high health dragons, I don't think it would be devastating whatsoever. But I still love this line that Surrender's gone for. You can get your Sarah down, then draw after the fact with the Twilight Runner that also gets a 9/8 on board on this turn. I think this is really heads up.
I completely didn't forget that this was a 9/8 and not a 5/4. I guess getting that board presence is also huge. And the 2 draws off Ysera immediately instead of overflow potentially lets Surrender stagger out the dragons a bit more.
Oh, it's again such an interesting crossroads, because Survival of the Fittest here does not buff dragons unless they're on the board, because it's portals that are shuffled into your deck, not the dragons themselves. So does he save Survival of the Fittest for a kind of pseudo Savage Roar just to buff up all his dragons when they're in play to go for lethal? Or is it the case that if the dragons are in play, he'll win anyway and he should just throw it down now to get the biggest board possible?
It's really hard without knowing the average outcomes of dragons, but I feel that the bigger question is, does Surrender have time to delay the dragons shuffled into deck once more? So Ysera takes an entire turn to get online and then another turn to draw all of those things. But this damage immediately is nothing to scoff at. Surrender is making his minions the toughest to deal with after he's seen Galakron, after he's seen Shadow Word Death. And Zephrys could just stick.
Yeah. The Mind Render Elutia, though, starts to make things very interesting for Kin, because that does allow him to start messing with all the Lightning Bloom nonsense that's in Surrender's hand.
Definitely looking at the other card that started with Mind there. The Mind Control, very nice for Kin. Lets him swing a ton of stats in the grand scheme of things. But the Broom, even just rushing Ysera in itself, comes in pretty clutch here.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, this was supposedly 20 mana of cards that got him these buffs, which makes it seem a bit less impressive. But the amount of tempo that this deck can generate once you get the survivals online is absurd.
I'm just marveling at the size of this broom.
This is
I
like
would
the
never
Nimbus
be able to carry that.
57,000
Yes.
billion.
The Nimbus Infinity.
Yeah.
For Kin, it's the same problem as last turn, and he doesn't have the health to quite just wait anymore. We might see a renewed dig turn. I mean, the Wave of Apathy lets him survive for a little
Right.
bit longer.
Like, he could obviously just dig with Renew to get Shadowword Ruin, but instead he's letting rip with the Mind Render, trying to find any kind of card draw, you'd have to imagine, to draw the dragons out of Surrender's deck, which he's found with Bloom Overflow.
It is an extremely good outcome for Kin. I couldn't tell you if he had a solid read on that or not, but he deliberately left himself the most mana available. Very tempting to play the Radiance with such a low health total and deny Surrender, denying Kin it the next turn.
Right.
But he just prioritizes getting the draws, pulls out not the greatest dragons though.
It's anything though. Any dragon that you can get is a huge win here for Kin. Dumping all the spells as well. Tick, tick, tick. Sign me up.
However, he's unable to play that huge speaker Gidra that Surrender will get back next turn and potentially clean up most of this board.
Runs out of time before he can get down Vate into Penance. This is, I mean, in a turn, you couldn't have a more perfect picture of Kin as a player. Spots an insanely cool play with this really difficult control deck, and then ropes out at the end because he's just that little bit too slow in how he has to think about all the different things.
His Cabal Acolyte is a huge draw for Surrender. Either the Elutia or the Poison are big steals here. What's the worst one he wants to give Kin? Probably the Glowfly Swarm. I don't think Surrender will end up playing the spell off of this. Or we could just see him take the bite and play it immediately with the Squall Hunter. The Madame Lazul is a gamble. It would have to depend on how well he can read what Kin most likely had drawn.
Okay.
At this point, you just take the Innervate and spend it so that Kin doesn't get it back.
Correct.
And
just
then
want to
it's
spend as much stuff as possible.
yeah, Radiant Squall Hunter most likely.
And now all of a sudden, the majority of Kin's good cards have been expended. He didn't get enough dragons to win the game outright. He's too overloaded to play Survival of the Fittest, even despite the reduction from the nature studies.
Sorry for my interruptive there, but that Kronks, at first, it's just my gut reaction to have that type of sound effect when we pop that Kronks, but it's actually not getting all that much done here. It's that 12/12 Ysera that is so problematic. Kin 1 mana off, going for Soul Mirror. Yikes!
So
How
he could
can
go
even hide behind these taunts.
Kronks Taunt, and then like trade the Brightwing into the Poisonous after taking down the Taunt.
Maybe even trade the 5/6. I mean, you end up with a Death Rattle and maintain a taunt. So it's just he's just thinking this Soul Mirror needs to save him for the next turn, and maybe he's out of the woods. Still a couple of dragons left in the deck, I believe. But other than that, Surrender sets are this Gidra.
Yeah, I mean,
that's pretty much it.
He knows he's dead. The only way that he survives is if the dragons fill up the board, so Gidra can't be played.
Yeah. That's a thing. The Gidra is not green.
Oh no, wait, but then you could
but the
sacrifice
Lazul, Lazul, the only small minion on Surrender's board, and that's gonna free up the space for Ysera, and Surrender will close out the game, despite Kin spotting very cool lines at different points this game.
Yeah, I'm going to say that was the coolest loss I've seen in a while. That was falling with style there from Kin, as he unfortunately loses the first game to Surrender, but multiple lines that I wouldn't necessarily have seen. And I think showing, again, how flexible this Priest deck is. It can be frustrating to play against. I'm the first player to admit that Priest is often a slog, an uphill climb to be beating. But one thing I will say is I absolutely love the direction of some of the new cards that they've been designing. Like Wave of Apathy it's such a flexible card. There are so many different utilizations that you can make work with it, as perfectly demonstrated there by Kin's excellent use of stealing the teacher's pet and then grave runesing it to make sure it would be resurrecting on his side of the board. It's a bunch of really cool puzzle pieces that you have to try and fit together however you see fit.
Yeah, I definitely see it feels Priest, despite having its big bag of tricks, though we're starting to see its weaknesses show through here and there. We saw Tom approach it with his zoo, but also a very threat-dense list of this druid, which has the full beast package, has Ysera, has the brooms for immediate reactivity, can also just go over the top and just say, deal with this wave, deal with the next wave. Eventually, you'll run out of Zephyruses or you'll run out of ways to deal with the board. And that is yet another way of approaching the matchup. So while Priest seems to have one of the best overall spreads across the board, I think in Last Hero Standing, there is room to exploit its few but noticeable weaknesses.
And speaking of weaknesses, this is Last Hero Standing that we are playing this week, which is a format all about trying to find the weaknesses in your opponent's deck, because the deck that wins gets to play again this week. So Surrender is going to be lining up his Druid once again. Kin has to find an answer to that with either his Galakron Warlock or his Mage, I believe, as the two unbanned decks left over. Which do you think you would have to favor? I know that Galakron Warlock isn't an especially popular deck at the moment, but trying to go back to the roots of our gameplay when Galakron Warlock was more popular, which would you favor?
I would have to imagine the Mage, actually. Just looking at the amount of removal the Warlock runs, it's tons of it, but it feels like Surrender's list is so threat dense with the double survival of the fittest that can pretty much negate Dark Sky's clearable boards a lot of the time, that I feel the Warlock could get overrun. However, we do know that in the Swiss portion, Surrender and Kin faced off, and it ended with Kin getting a 3-0 sweep with this Warlock. So maybe there's something I'm not seeing here. I do just think that Mage might more consistently be able to aggro down the Druid, though.
Yeah, I mean, Mage is a deck that I still go back and forth on all the time. I was ragging on it yesterday after Tiz had a terrible streak where he went like 0-7 before he picked up a couple of games. And then on the same day, we see Muzzy talking about how great the deck is. We see Killing All Day hitting rank 1 Legend with specifically Muzzy's Tempo Mage build of the deck. It's a deck that's very, very difficult to play and seems to have wildly varying amounts of success from day to day.
Yeah, it seems very much like a deck that, to quote a great man, it can be the best of times or the worst of times. Feast of Famine, quite or type of deck. However, for Kin, this particular list, I feel, does have a bit more game against Druid, has the Shenvala and the Jandice, and I think that hitting the early curve, not necessarily early if I'm talking about Jandice, but just having minions on curve instead of trying to rely on the big blowout turns, I feel is a more consistent way to approach versus Druid.
Yeah, I think it's a very good list versus Druid. The one of devolving missiles as well can be a big deal. Chewing through Teacher's Pet, taking out a Twilight Runner can be a huge deal if they just have to play it out on 5 mana without the Guardian animals along the way.
And Surrender's opener is looking rather slow. Fungal Fortunes isn't coming back. The rest of these just look like they're not getting played for a very long time. It's high risk, but I felt like Surrender needed card draw.
Wow. I mean, Savage Roar is interesting, right? Because even with just animated Broomstick, that's a 3 damage and a 2 damage removal spell in one fell swoop. So if, like, Sorcerer's Apprentice was played on that turn, that would have been the board clear to clear both of them off.
Fair. Surrendering the crystal powers that I think quickly fell out of favor as people went all in with the beast package, and if they're not running Mount Seller, that's definitely not in the list anymore. So this could be just Surrender saying, I'm gonna wait to play Guardian Animals the old-fashioned way, and he just wants to survive up till that point, so the Savage Roar removal option definitely shows where his head is at.
I'm calling this play the Gia Supreme, because every time I talk to you about Mage or the differences in our playstyle, you are a jam Shenvala onto the board gamer.
It's so tough to deal with for Druid there. It took a Broom and a Savage Roar, which is not in the deck for Surrender. And that did end up pretty poorly for Kin, but he still at least has initiative now.
I mean, that was so big, the difference that made. That if Surrender had not picked the Savage Roar and gone with the Fungal Fortunes, as I was kind of thinking he might do, to try and find the ramp cards to get up to Guardian Animals, he might just be out of the game with the 5/5s that could be summoned.
Yeah, that definitely saved him for the time being, but this draw also potentially saves him from this Ras wreaking havoc for a couple turns. Without the Lightning Bloom, Surrender would have had to go for Teacher's Pet, and then Kin could have ripped the Devolving Missiles and just pressured Surrender down. But now we're looking at some beasts rushing out right now.
Yeah, it's a little bit messy with it being exactly 6 health. It's not the easiest one to deal with, but Lake Thresher in this will be able to very tidily deal with it.
Imagine complaining about that.
All right. Fine. I was just wondering if you do go for Teacher's Pet there, because obviously we can see the Devolving Missiles, but there's only one of them in the deck. I really don't think it would be the worst play ever, because unless Overgrowth or an Innovate is found, Surrender's play on turn 6 was looking a little bit weak. But you're right, I am being a negative Nancy here.
Yeah, it's a fair concern you brought up about the next turn being potentially weak had Surrender not drawn things like this to smooth out his curve. I just feel that leaving up Ras for too long is asking for trouble. It could suddenly snowball into so much damage.
And it looks like Kin is still waiting yet another turn. I mean, he technically doesn't have a payoff card in the strict sense of Shenvala or the Mana Cyclone. But for me, Evocation is kind of a payoff card for Apprentice in its own right.
And so was the Mana Giant.
Yeah.
Might be pretty ambitious to hope to get the 7 down to 0 all in one turn, but Kin is saying that he can afford to wait a little more. Getting the 1 Thieves down this turn gives him potentially more juice and more mana to work with. It's very patient, and the card draw, we'll see if it pays off for him.
Gia, Kin is a potion gamer. Finally, I've met my worthy champion. Potion of Illusion picked, and it is going to pop off 100% of the time.
Yeah, with the Apprentice, it's unfortunate though that his Primordial Studies isn't picking up anything cheap. I'm not sure if he can fit in the Steward in there or the big pop-off turn, but he still has one more draw to try and find that Cyclone and go absolutely nuts. Surrender himself is gearing up for the pop-off with the Dragons Overflow in hand for next turn.
That's true. That's when things start to get pretty much unwinnable at that point. But that is a 0 mana card that he can just throw onto the board to make room in his hand. This has got to be very, very tempting as the pop-off turn, right? You've seen Ysera. Next turn onwards, there's just going to be too many dragons.
But is there enough mana to do it? So if he goes Apprentice, Lab Partner, Potion, and then the other Apprentice, you still have mana to play a bunch of spells, and then it would depend on the evocation results, whether you can get down the Mana Giants as well.
While I am memeing, I don't think it's a potion turn this turn. I think you're instead just going off with the evocation instead and trying above all else, no matter what, to get down Giant plus Conjurer's Calling on this turn.
Yeah. Well,
I was wrong. He's got to go so fast, though. The rope's already burning.
We'll test Kin's APM. He got a great result off of that Devolving Missiles, ending on a 4/4. But everything looks to be secret, a little bit too expensive. Oh no!
Disaster!
That is a huge disaster. He's not sitting on any freeze effects either to try and delay the board that will no doubt be popping off from Surrender this turn.
That's a side quest, so there's no secret Surrender has to worry about. It is just go off here. Play your Overflow. It's 1 mana instead of 0. Who gives a damn?
Dragons?
No
Not
dragons!
a single dragon!
What?
But he has this broom to fully clean up, and this Kael'thas gets to stick.
I mean, he's in the lead, but it's not
Yeah.
over. If he'd got any reasonable amount of dragons, the game ended on the spot.
And looking at it again, this doesn't look like it warrants a broom for this turn. Surrender just going for another Kael'thas cycle, another draw, and probably ending with hero power. Works out fine. As long as he can remove the Apprentice. 1 spell damage minion sticking is not a big deal whatsoever.
Oh,
Oh, Bog Beam! That's
get
another
down.
cycle.
Wild Growth as well? Oh my god!
This card was nerfed, right?
That was me.
Well, for Kin, it's not over, but he certainly needs to generate ways to stall alongside these mana giants
Yeah.
sticking.
So is the play to hold off for a turn and go Steward in the anticipation of a Frost Nova?
It's optimistic, but I
Yeah.
think given that Surrender is most likely just going to widen his board next turn, and if you don't freeze this current board, your giants just get traded down and you lose that win condition. I like waiting. He needs to be optimistic to win the game as opposed to playing mana giants and just surviving sometimes a little bit longer.
Well, he's saying, please don't kill me on this turn. Don't pop off with the double survival of the fittest, which is possible on this turn, technically, from Surrender.
I think it is reasonable to assume you won't die this turn.
Yeah.
He's also going to finish the Elemental Ally side quest next turn and draw some spells once he gets the mana giants down. Yeah, I like the patience from Kin. It's great recognition.
Yeah, it's that spot where you've got to cheese. It's the only way you're going to get there.
But how can Surrender cheese here? Certainly thinking about closing out the game as soon as possible. You were mentioning the survival of the fittest out, so we could see Twilight Runner rushed with the broom.
Mm-hmm.
But he would have to get big draws.
Interesting. I mean, saving the broom is something that I can absolutely get on board with, because freeze is where things go wrong here. The interesting thing to me is filling up his board to the extent at which he can't play a minion and broom on the same turn. I think it's actually arguably a mistake here, just in the fringe scenarios where Kin is able to generate a big threat and freeze the entire board.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. It's pretty much the only way Surrender loses from here, barring some crazy box outs. If you're gonna go all in with the minions, it feels inconsistent to save broom at that point.
Yep.
But anyway, Kin doesn't get Nova per se, but he puts together a very big Cyclone turn nonetheless.
Yeah, I wonder if he was factoring in the side quest there, because he could have just played a giant first up, right, and seen his options.
It's true. Not necessarily sure. Well, it's a big deal that the Twilight Runner was not able to be frozen. Surrender, get some more draws, can potentially find survival of the fittest.
Yeah, I mean, he can clear the board already, right? Just by trading both in and then going Thresher, Broomstick. That's clear.
Pretty disgusting. Of course, good to start with the draws.
Or a Gidra plus Guardian Animals, even if he didn't have board space. Like, pick your poison as to how you want to go about this one.
Anything from nature studies? He has to be thinking about actually even finding lethal at this point. I don't think he can do it anymore now that the Tiger had gone through.
Oh, Power of the Wild.
Time waits for no one.
But again,
does that get him out of any breakpoints? There's some 3 health minions, so Flame Strike, you're not necessarily playing around it, getting that. And again, the other options all look like they weren't doing much of anything.
Yeah, I see your point. Like, the board is one at this point anyway, so you may as well just go for like Crystal Power to have a little bit of extra.
My hand is too full.
Oh! Sorry, just in case any damage does start coming through to face.
So Kin, we're getting to that time of day in Mage games where it's just generate freeze, generate box to try and survive, because the win conditions that are naturally in the deck are all used up.
It's a tome of intellect kind of situation here that he has to go for to have any chance whatsoever. Jandis, I don't think there's any minions in the pool that could keep him alive for that extra turn.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it. The Cone of Cold can get rid of maximum 16 damage from the board. And he's technically alive if it's just those other 4 minions that can attack. However, Surrender is
Skidra.
running buffs.
Yeah. All in all, it doesn't even really start to come close. And Surrender, again, with the Druid deck, his old school Druid deck he's got here with the Kael'thas in there, not running any of the new stuff that people are going for with Mount Sellers or Malagos. Just looking like old school Druid, like Kael'thas nerf didn't do anything at all.
Yeah, it just looked absolutely dominant there. Kin, despite having a very good mana cyclone turn, maybe there was a little blip in the elemental allies. You and I had questions about that, whether he had to go super all in with the cyclone or even hold back a bit longer, or at least trigger the draws off the cyclone first before. Off the allies first before playing the cyclone. I'm not sure about how to optimize that, but he really did need to find additional frees to get in that game. It's not to say nothing went Kin's way there, and things really need to the stars kind of need to align when you're playing the mage deck.
Yeah, they do, but it's a good point you bring up, right? Because at that point he was already in very dire straits. He needed something very, very positive to go his way, which I think the outcome that could have made him be in with a chance was play the giant, draw the minions from the elemental allies, and then go magic trick Frost Nova. It's pretty niche already, and a lot of things have to go your way for that to work out. But that's where he was at. That's the kind of situation that you have to be in to have any real chance there at all. However, Gia, if he was going to have one final deck to try and reverse sweep all 3 of Surrender's lineup with, so far, his Warlock has been showing the potential to win a lot of games of Hearthstone.
Yes, it has, at least based on Kin's previous matchups. We did mention that he took a 3-0 sweep over Surrender in the Swiss this deck, but based on Kin's queue, you can see that he would much rather have Mage against Druid than this Warlock. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the Warlock's unfavored in this matchup. In order for it to get a win, I think it's unlikely to expect the Warlock to curve out enough to pressure Druid, and instead they need to outlast wave after wave of, so it's going to be very, very difficult. However, the list from Kin is running Zephrys towards the end. Double Plague of Flames will be key in the matchup as well. So it's not impossible.
And I like the kind of dichotomy that you're bringing up there within the deck of the removal package and the damage package, like the meat of the deck. Because for me, that's what you want to dial in on. Getting the Dragonflight Cultist down, getting down any Invoke, the Worshipper down as well, drawing your deck, invoking Galakron, getting the Demons down. Because while neither half of the deck is especially well equipped to deal specifically with Druid, I feel like the pressure makes it the most awkward for Druid, because with Swipe having been removed from the list for Surrender, Dragonblight Cultist and all the 1/1 imps can do a surprising amount of work.
Yeah, and even if it's not damage-based work, they always will remain threats as Plague of Flames activators later on in the game. And Surrender's opening hand looks pretty awkward indeed, didn't hit much ramp, or no permanent ramp at least. Nature Studies could potentially help him finish Overgrowth next turn though.
Well, we were talking about the
Mark of Nature to just
right.
Yeah, curves out somewhat.
And we were talking about the fear of just your opponent curving out, needing to find answers to that. And the best way that Druid has that, really, in my opinion, is proactive development or drawing Overgrowth for 3 mana off the top of your deck will also probably get the job done.
Yeah, the Mark of Nature wouldn't have been bad there whatsoever. Would have meant that the Panther could trade over several of Kin's minions, but Surrender obviously prefers going for game plan A, which is ramp and get done. Lake Thresher can come down this turn, and I don't think it's very easy to answer should the 3-2 trade off the 3-1. Kin would have to expend Nether Breath and double trades.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that they're not developing on that turn, right? They're not going coin shield. They're not playing out a Veiled Worshipper as a 5/4. And every turn that they're not doing that is such a big win for Surrender. So I
It
agree.
really is. Especially since going for Lightning Bloom into Overflow kind of messes up his curve for the near
Yes.
future. Yeah, and the 1/1s actively work against Kin here. If he wanted to develop anything, he would have to trade off the 1/1s, make sure that the Thresher can't cleave over them. He could gamble by playing a taunt minion, but it feels quite risky.
It's scary. You know, it will be on the left-hand side, so the cleave isn't devastating quite yet for Kin, but like you said, it's playing with fire.
There is a buff card, and there is for Surrender. Becomes a bit awkward, but I doubt Surrender will pass up 4 mana just to get a cleaner trade here.
But then again, it's awkward, right? Because he wants to get the heal with Overflow on his minion, which means unless he wants to heal the shield as well.
Power?
Right, that's what I'm thinking about here. Is that insane?
No, I kind of like it. He does end up with 6 mana next turn, which is nowhere you want to be with Druid. You want 7 or more available so he can play Guardian Animals. But the benefit he gets of removing the Shield of Galakrond and making his Thresher healthy again, I feel is worth it for the time being.
I just think it's great recognition of what you're trying to do in the matchup, which is, like I said, not die to the pressure, and therefore locking down board at all costs is the way that that is achieved.
It's also worth noting that there's possibilities that Surrender gets his Innervates off of the draw alongside one of these expensive spells.
Right.
Or even just a 5-cost piece, which is not the worst thing in the world to follow up with. Meanwhile, Kin has been curving out pretty consistently indeed. Is it going to be enough?
Yeah, that was destined right from the starting hand. He kept these 3 cards in his starting hand, and he played them all out, one after the other, pretty simply.
Oh, the Bog Beams are... It's overkill. But
I mean,
without the Chaos in hand, I don't feel overly attached to the Bog Beams.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't so much how attached to the Bog Beams are you, it was how attached to Broomstick are you, because it could have been Bog Beam Broomstick and attack in just to keep the board in play as much as possible.
Yeah, I was thinking just trying to keep Thresher alive, but I suppose at 2 HP, it wasn't worth it at that point to surrender.
That's true.
Important thing is he gets the Ysera down on curve. He has double Survival of the Fittest in hand and the Overflow as the dragons start coming down. And this is a matchup where, outside of exactly Twisting Nether and Active Zephyrus, I would say you do want a bunch of dragons to come down at the same time so that they're out of range of Dark Skies, and so that there's so many minions that a Plague of Flames can't get through all of them at once.
Yeah, I guess if you go to the extremes of like having all 7 minions in play, then yeah, Plague of Flames does become kind of difficult to deal with. But I mean, I think you just kind of brought it up there yourself. Is if it's a small board, it's Dark Skies. If it's a medium board, it's Plague of Flames. If it's a huge board, it's Twisting Nether. Warlock has the answers to keep this in check for quite a while to come.
However, Twisting Nether is just a one-of in the deck, so on average, I feel it would be better to go quite wide. We do see it's in hand for Kin. Wow.
Okay.
These results.
These are pretty good.
Keep it coming, keep it coming. He has this Survival of the Fittest. Ship this face every single day of the week, just hoping that Kin doesn't have the one-of Nether in hand. It's there, though.
Yeah, and even if he does here, I think you're far from devastated to see this from Surrender. You're still assuming that you're winning here with being able to draw more dragons from your deck. Just get down this 9/8 Twilight Runner on this turn, even with a couple of Broomsticks if you want, to set up for lethal with the survival next turn.
So does this Guardian Animals have 1 Thresher, 1 Runner in it at this point? I'm not quite sure how many are left. But if it's 2 minions, I feel like he would that over the single runner or the Overflow. I feel like the one-way surrender loses if he goes super greedy and plays survival here, and then Kin just
Right.
reverses with the active Galakrond. We saw Kin turbo out the invokes, he played the Kronks, and just got the Galakrond in hand. Surrender knows that's the one thing he has to be worried about, and so Minions, I think, is the perfect way to keep Kin from developing his own.
It gets pretty interesting now, doesn't it? I do like that Surrender is developing just a 1-mana 5/5 here to threaten a much more likely lethal next turn. But I feel like even not having done the discrete maths, this is clearable for Kin in one way or another with Moargs in play.
Is it? It's 23 HP. Well, it take not just one spell, obviously. The Moarg, Nether Breath plus Dark Skies, I think, gets through everything. So there's 9 cards in hand. If you start with Moarg, Nether Breath, then the Dark Skies will get 7 procs. Or 14 damage. Actually a little bit short, huh?
Yeah, he can finish with Mortal Coil, but if he wants to tap, then he can't. Okay.
So that gets 8 procs, 16 damage. You're not dealing with the Twilight Runner most of the time, I think, but he's just hoping that the Thresher gets dealt with, and it did. About the average outcome. Dragons, right on time for Surrender. Immediate refill. Survival of the to buff even that little 2/3 into a big threat.
And who shuffled Surrender's deck? These are just all right on the top.
It is pretty perfect, huh?
Okay.
Just jam the survival.
That's what I'm looking at as the first instinct play to me.
Looks pretty good. Only thing Surrender's worried about now is active Zephyrus, I have to assume.
Yeah. Which is possible,
And so,
you know, at this point.
In this scenario, he actually doesn't want to get any more dragons drawn off of the Twilight Runner, but there's barely any left at this point.
I think it's only
so it's
one.
not a big risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Saw a yellow card, but it's not Zephyrus.
Yeah. Dark Skies plus the Nether Drake, it's just not enough.
If he gets an incredible Dark Skies, as in all of them land on the Poisonous, so after Moarg, Nether Breath on the 13/8, you go Dark Skies, hope it clears the 6/8, then he can technically stay alive. It is highly, highly unlikely. I think he was just trying to get Zephyrus there. Didn't find it, and Surrender completes an easy sweep with Druid. Very impressive.
And you know what, Gia? I think a lot more about Surrender's strategy coming to last year as standing is becoming clear to me at this point. He doesn't care about playing Warrior. Doesn't matter that he's playing the decks that have done a little bit weaker this week with Mage and Rogue, because all he plays is the Druid. That's all that matters for him, if you can just sweep with it and draw like that every game. It was, I think, you know, jokes aside, it was not a perfect draw from him every game. He got some good outcomes. You know, he was hitting the Overgrowth with relative consistency, and he didn't get any completely dead draws like we saw from him last week, which was pretty devastating. But it was just a very well-played set of Druid games, all things considered. I think he spaced out his threats very well and knew exactly what to play for in all of the matchups.
I'm just actively holding myself back from making tons of sweep jokes because he played a ton of broomsticks that series. But it really comes off the back of that game 2 broomstick with the Savage Roar pick that you and I were not expecting whatsoever. Had gone for that, he would very well have lost to the Shanvala pop-off, and then we could have seen the series go the distance. Maybe the Mage and Rogue would have gotten preyed on there. But that's all what if Surrender found the lines, and he is advancing to the winners match later on to face either Tyler or Possessi.
And yeah, well, he is going to the upper bracket. Kin, unfortunately, in a very Kin style, we do see him losing because I think that was the kind of the... Well, no, it's true, because this is the story of last season, was that every single week we saw him play and we were like, I really like that play. Well, I think he's playing really well here. Oh, that's a really interesting line. These are cool deck lists he's bringing. and he just lost. It didn't matter for Kin. There's some kind of curse upon his head, it would seem, because despite loving most of the lines he's going for, the occasional rope being the biggest hindrance to his play, it's just not working out for him. But he does, of course, still have the chance to turn things around, as he will fight things out in the losers bracket. But before we go through to that, we're going to find out who else is going to be down in the elimination bracket and who is going to be going up against Surrender. Because first of all, we have Tyler up against Possessi. Possessi, of course, and Tyler have both got back-to-back top 8, so